When you see somebody who is jacked, are they necessarily healthier? What are the risks to being jacked? Do they also have increased fat mass? Okay, a couple questions here. So when you see someone who is jacked, are they necessarily healthier? I think when I think about somebody's muscle mass levels, I think about it as being a sort of threshold type thing that if they're above a certain point, I'm less worried about their long-term risk for sarcopenia or other sort of health conditions associated with very low levels of muscle mass and poor muscle function. If you think about sarcopenia, that's literally just having less muscle mass, too little muscle mass, and poor muscle function. And usually how this works is you lose so much muscle mass that then muscle function becomes impaired, and then quality of life and health tends to suffer. But when I think about things on the opposite side, I'm really trying to make sure that somebody has enough muscle mass where they're at zero or very little risk of developing that unless something really, really bad happens. And so we were joking around about if we had like this gains composite score that we'd put together a few things that would tell us like if somebody had a relatively high level of musculoskeletal health. And so it'd be like their chest measurement, their waist circumference, their bench press 1RM, like a leg press or squat 1RM. And then you'd have something like their test levels to make sure that it wasn't above the normal range, so they weren't on anabolics. Unless at super physiological doses, you'd have like a depression inventory, like a few other things. It's more of a joke, but we could come up with a gain score, write an article about it, and people would love it. As far as the risks of being too jacked, in general, if we eliminate any sort of discussion about polypharmacy, my main concern is when people's BMI creeps above 30. Because yes, you will have more muscle mass, like in general, individuals with obesity or if their BMI is over 30, or individuals with overweight, they will carry more lean body mass in general than those with lower BMIs, but the risks from carrying too much fat mass kind of outweigh the additional benefits, if any, of carrying more muscle mass. So that's kind of that inflection point I'm thinking about. And then as far as do they always have increased fat mass? Well, certainly not. There are people walking around with a lot of lean body mass and not a lot of fat mass. But again, I think once you get to that BMI over 30, and certainly 35, I do start to concern myself, or I am concerned with excess fat mass, and then again, how they got there. So are they just a freak, an outlier, in which case, cool. But if they used some assistance that has their own risks for attaining that level of muscularity, I do have concerns. And also, I don't know that it's beneficial to their health compared to having less and not choosing those avenues to attain that level of muscularity.
Yeah, when I talked about this topic in the initial sarcopenia discussion, mentioned how research has kind of looked at what tends to correlate better with health outcomes, the amount of muscle mass that you have or muscle strength. And we found that strength actually tends to be more predictive and more closely related. So if you substituted in this question, when you see somebody who is jacked, are they necessarily healthier? If you just subbed that out and said, are they stronger? Are they necessarily healthier? I think many of you can probably recognize that that's not necessarily the case, right? Somebody who can squat 500 is not necessarily healthier than somebody who can squat 495 or 405. That is kind of like the threshold effect that Jordan's talking about. Above a certain level, additional strength, additional muscle mass is going to have very little additional health impact. But certainly at very low, going from extremely low levels to moderate amounts is going to have substantial impacts. And then those benefits taper off pretty quickly. It's more so a matter of, as you progress in life, how much of that falls away? How much of that do you lose? Which can, of course, be mitigated to an enormous extent through continued training. So that's kind of my view on this, is paying more attention to muscle strength and muscle function over the amount of mass. And then definitely above a certain level, like for example, probably all of us have maximized the health benefits that there are to be had through just our ability to produce force. In other words, in terms of strength. None of us are under the illusion that adding another 10 pounds or even 10% to any of our lifts is going to make us any healthier. If anything, it's going to be more detrimental to our mental health trying to get there. But we're all okay with that, and we signed up for that.
Yeah. I'd also make the point that if I see somebody who can squat like 700 pounds, for example, or somebody who's like 260 pounds, relatively lean, carrying a ton of muscle mass, at that point, I'm starting to concern myself, well, okay, if they've achieved this sort of specialization in either muscularity and or muscular strength, what's their cardiorespiratory fitness look like? Because we know, again, there's that dose-dependent relationship between cardiorespiratory fitness and sort of reduction in risk from heart disease. And it's like, in order to specialize in strength power sports, in general, you're giving up some of that cardiorespiratory fitness development. So striking that perfect, inflection point, it's an optimization problem, right? And you're going to get to two different points if you're optimizing health versus optimizing performance in a particular sport. And so for the sport, it might be a feature and not a bug, but for health, it may be a bug. And as far as convincing somebody who has dedicated their entire life's training to getting as muscular as possible or as strong as possible, to like, we may need to compromise some of your training resources, some of your training outcomes for this other thing that you are concerned with less based on where you're at now. That can be a tough conversation to have.
Well, and I think it's interesting the different approaches we all take to it, because for me, there is that paper where they looked at mental health in Olympic athletes, where I think if we're going to look at the definition of jacked, being in the Olympiad would check that box for a lot of people.
Sure.
And the rates were relatively high. I believe it was like 60 to 75% had some type of mental health diagnosis associated with it. And if that's the case, like, depends on how we're defining health.
Yeah.
We probably have some other metrics that are worth discussing along the way.
We'll come up with that gain score. We'll flesh it out.